As important as the whole issue of Australia's vaccine rollout is, there's another issue I don't want you to miss in all the hurly-burly of the past 24 hours and all this talk about AstraZeneca. In South Australia, the debt-driven business empire of an Indian-born British businessman is now teetering on the brink, with both the South Australian and the Morrison governments considering some sort of bailout for the Whyalla Steelworks that this businessman, Sanjeev Gupta, bought 5 years ago with the sales pitch of making so-called green steel or steel from renewable energy. The Whyalla Steelworks has about 1,500 workers. It is by far the biggest employer in this regional city of around 20,000 residents. Now, I've been to Whyalla a couple of times. It's a hard-working, pretty resilient community. Indeed, Whyalla, it should be said, has survived economic shocks before, such as the closure of the BHP shipyard in the late 70s and the loss of some 2,000 jobs at the time. Employment at the steel mill has also fallen from 5,000 40 years ago to just a third of those numbers today. Now, for a whole lot of economic and national security reasons, it's critical that Australia continues to make steel. And the Whyalla plant, while much smaller than Port Kembla on the New South Wales coast, well, it's the only producer of Australia's rail lines. And it's a big source of the steel used in construction. So obviously, it's desirable that the plant continues to operate. But that doesn't mean that governments should necessarily just bail out the current operator, Gupta, on the basis that it's saving, quote, regional jobs and protecting the national interest. There is a case for government intervention where markets have failed or where a vital national interest is at stake. But protecting a particular business from its own misjudgments or mistakes, well, that really makes sense. It's not the government's job, is it, to protect any individual's personal fortune if, as in this case, the business has too much debt with a failed financier and can't readily borrow again. There are two essential problems for steelmaking in this country. The first, it's a massive glut of steel fed by subsidised overproduction in China. And yes, you're putting two and two together. The downside of our ever-increasing iron ore sales to China is massive pressure on Australia's domestic steelmaking industry. The second problem is more expensive and less reliable power in this country, which runs to about 25% of the cost of producing a tonne of steel in this country, and helps to explain why Australia's steelmaking costs are about 10% higher than elsewhere. Rather than give emergency loans to prop up a British billionaire's business, at least in the first instance, governments in Australia should be dealing with the market abnormalities. Now, first, maintaining anti-dumping duties on below-cost Chinese steel, and second, and it's most critical, addressing the problems with our own power supply. Unfortunately, Australian governments, state and federal, have consistently ignored the vast ramifications for manufacturing in this country of the drive to make our power supply emissions-free rather than affordable and reliable. Like making aluminium. Making steel, like aluminium, is hugely and unavoidably energy intensive. And it requires energy that's reliable, not energy that's only available when the sun shines or the wind blows. Yet instead of honestly facing these facts, that more renewable energy means less manufacturing and fewer jobs, governments have tried to have it both ways. And to do that, they've ended up subsidising the power costs of industries that used to be economic before renewable energy came along. That's cheap, all right, when the weather's favourable, but thereby eroding the competitiveness of baseload power from coal, which can't be turned up or down as the sun passes through clouds or the wind falls away. For instance, federal and state governments have just tipped in another $160 million of your money, taxpayer dollars, to keep the Portland aluminium smelter in Victoria going, on top of an earlier handout of $240 million. Now, that's your money paid to a private company because they can't afford the power because of government policy and activist pressure power that's making it more and more expensive for business to turn on. And it's just going to get worse, thanks to the emissions obsession that seems to drive all decision making. Every day there's more deference to the climate cult, isn't there? The latest is a proposal to Infrastructure Victoria that all cars sold in that state be electric by 2030, so banning petrol and diesel vehicles, even though last year less than half of 1% of cars sold in Australia were electric. You can see where this is all going, can't you? Within a few years, we'll only be allowed to drive electric cars, and to stop them being, in effect, coal-fired cars because of the coal in our grid, the coal will go in place of more wind and more solar. It won't be available at night. And it's at night when most of these electric cars will need to be recharged. Honestly, is anyone writing these insane policies in government even thinking them through? The only help in all of this is the electorate. It's you, the voter. You killed off a carbon tax when you sent Kevin Rudd packing, and if the PM wanted to make the next election about manufacturing and Australia's future, I reckon the result for Labor could be just the same. For a coalition government in Canberra desperate to get back onto the issues that matter, this PM, it's a no-brainer.